subject for discussion this evening is life, death, and beyond. He's speaking of the human condition and of the fact that really we know nothing at all. That we're surrounded by this great mystery of life which we do not really understand. And Job asks a very interesting question. He says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you understand." Anyone here who thinks he might be 100 or 1,000 or 10,000? This is a serious question when I ask how old you think you are. And indeed, if we're to try to understand this subject of life, death, and the world beyond, we have to come to understand the origin of all things. So let me ask you the question. When God created the universe, whoever or whatever you imagine God to be, we'll leave that aside. But when God created the universe, what did God create it out of? Now, some of you might be budding scientists or philosophers. Has anybody got any answers to that? What did God create the universe out of? What is this world? What is the solar system, the whole universe created out of? Any suggestions? Well, what do the scientists, some of you are scientists, so what are you scientists going to say? Now, this is a serious question. Sorry? Yes, you're speaking of the Big Bang. But what was before the Big Bang then? If the Big Bang, if the Big Bang, we understand that this whole universe of matter suddenly came into being, out of what did it actually derive its existence? Carbon. Yeah, but where did the carbon come from? You see, this is an important question, which it involves us in not just a scientific quest, but also a philosophical quest. Let me put it this way. When God created the universe, going right back to the beginning, do you think that one day God was walking down the road, supposing there was such a thing, and he found a lump of stuff, and he said, good, now I've got something to create the universe out of? Is that feasible? No. Well, why not? Well, exactly. That's the point. If God found a lump of stuff to create the universe out of, who created the lump of stuff that God found? Well, we must think this out, because if you ask people this question, you get a variety of answers, and of course there is one very simple, logical, truthful answer to this question. It's a simple answer, actually, when you see it. What did God use to create the universe out of? There was nothing else for God to use but himself. So God, whoever or whatever you conceive God to be, however you conceive of God, God created the whole universe out of himself, out of spirit. In the beginning there was only pure spirit, mind, intelligence, wisdom. There was nothing physical, nothing that could manifest to the physical senses, just pure spirit. We're on good theological grounds here, because the Bible says God is spirit. Actually, in the New Testament it says God is a spirit. And when the translators came to translate the original Greek into the English of our New Testament, they thought it better to put God is a spirit. But in the original Greek it just says God is spirit, energy, mind, thought, intelligence. You see that? So when we say that God created everything out of himself, what we have to picture in our mind was that at a certain point in time, which again is that's the wrong way of saying it, because there was no time before the Big Bang, but time and space began with the Big Bang. But if you think of the Big Bang as that moment when time began, when the physical universe began to appear out of what hitherto had been invisible, spirit, then you begin to get the picture that I want us to have this evening. Everything was created out of spirit. Is that acceptable? Can you accept that as a working thesis? Everything was created out of spirit. Nothing else that it could come from. And those of you who are studying science will know something about relativity, and you will know something about the relationship of matter to energy or spirit. So taking this a step further, it follows that if everything was created out of spirit or out of God, whichever way you want to express it, there is not a thing in this world, not a thing in this universe that is not created out of God. Are you with me so far? So the table on which I sit, the chairs in which you recline, the floor upon which we stand, everything around us is a densification of spirit. Do you agree with that? It is energy whose vibration has been stepped down so that it actually manifests to us on the physical and material plane. I don't know whether that's a difficult concept or not. It oughtn't to be, because if you think about water, the different forms in which water can exist, as steam, as water vapour, it's virtually invisible. But if that water vapour comes in contact with a cold surface, it then condenses upon it and collects into drops of water, and we're all familiar with water as the liquid which we drink and which is, of course, vital for all life. But think what happens to the water below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It then becomes solid. So you see that the same element is capable of existing in the various forms, and we could say that in its densest form, water comes to us as ice, but in its more rarefied, most spiritual form, if you like, it's water vapour, it's virtually invisible. So the physical, material world is created out of spirit or energy. So that if you had a powerful enough electron microscope and looked at some particles of matter, you would find that there was nothing solid about matter at all. And of course this is a concept with which all of you who are studying physics will be familiar. There's nothing solid at all, although you can wrap your knuckles on the table and it sounds solid. In fact, if you looked at it under sufficiently powerful magnification, you would find that it was nothing but atoms and whirling electron subatomic particles and so on. We won't go into the subject of how it is that they cohere and hold together. The point is, where do you come from? If all around us has come from God, if everything is created out of spirit, then where have you and I come from? How old are you? Let me ask you another question. I asked how old you were. We ask ourselves this question now. When did you first begin to exist? When was the first moment of your existence? Well, was it when you were born? Was it when you were conceived after your parents made love?
Yeah.
You say yes. So, sorry?
When the world was first created.
When the world was first created, of course. Because how could you just have come into existence just at the moment of your conception? At this point, it might be useful if we think about what is a human being in any case. You have a physical body, quite obviously, but you are not just a physical being, because you have a soul, you have a spirit, you have within you a certain something which enables you to say, I am. and you could put your own name after it. So we might call this the ego or the self-consciousness. Man is different from animals and the rest of creation around him in that he has this ability to think about himself and to say, I am. If you've got a pet dog or cat, the dog doesn't say, I am Rover. He doesn't think of himself in that way at all. The chances are if the dog could think about himself or does think about himself, he would think that he was a human being. But we are body and soul and spirit, and there's a part of us which we call the self-consciousness or ego, that which enables us to identify ourselves. So when you came into existence in this lifetime, you came actually from spirit. And there came a moment when your parents made love and you said, that's it, this is my opportunity, and you as a spiritual being united with that fertilized egg cell. Can you see what we're saying? So you came into incarnation, you came from the spiritual plane into physical incarnation. So what is going to happen to you when you die? We're thinking about life and death and beyond. Why are we here in any case? I've heard of 3 people in the last 24 hours that have died. One was 90, another was 93, and another was 54. The average is about 70-something. The Bible talks about 70 years and 10. People today are living a little bit longer. Many people are living into their 90s. But not many people live to be 110, do they? But the world, the earth, has been around for, 5,000 million years, I think, at the latest estimate. And what is 70 or 100 years or even 1,000 years in the whole history of the earth or of the solar system or of the universe? If you come from spirit, when you're born into this earth, when the time comes for you to leave it, where do you go back to? Well, what do you think? Do you cease to exist at the moment of your death? These are things which we can think about. They are, of course, religious and spiritual questions and philosophical questions, but they vitally concern every one of us. And, of course, when the Lord asked Job the question, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you understand. What he was in fact saying to Job was, you were there, Job, but can you remember it? And of course he could not. And neither can you or I remember our past existence in planes of spirit. But undoubtedly we did exist, and we shall continue to exist. So this brings us to the whole question of life and death, and life beyond, the purpose of life, why we're here, where did we come from, where are we going, who is God, what is God, all of these questions. So I want to suggest to you that there never was a time when you did not exist. And there will never come a time when you will cease to be. According to the Bible, you were there when God created the worlds, when he flung the stars out into space, when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. I didn't say it, the Bible said that. And science leads us to that same understanding. For that which exists and has no end also has no beginning. There never was a time when you did not exist, and there will never come a time when you will cease to be. You are soul of his soul, spirit of his spirit, being of his being, essence of his essence. There never was a time when you did not exist. and there will never come a time when you will cease to be. Now, I don't know whether that makes you feel good or not. So what do you think you're doing here on earth? Did somebody say having a good time? Well, I hope that you are. But what is the purpose of life? What is the purpose of incarnation? We're coming up to the Christmas season and we're thinking about Jesus being an incarnation of God. But don't you see that in a sense you also are an incarnation of God? If you were created out of God and everything was created out of God, then are you not also an incarnation of God? Well, if you are not, what are you? So why are we here? What is the purpose of life? What do you perceive to be your raison d'etre? What's your purpose of being? Our physical bodies will disintegrate, but because we are eternal beings, there is part of us which must survive. And so your suggestion is that in some way or other we're gaining experience. Would anybody like to enlarge upon that or offer more light?
Why are we worshipping God if you aren't God?
Why should we worship God, did you say?
Why belong to God if we're all God? If we're all part of God?
Well, now, the question you're asking is fundamental to an understanding of our entire subject tonight, because the chances are that you have never heard anything quite like this before this evening. I hope that you have. It's not original with me. But what we're really talking about is consciousness, are we not? That's what God was talking about when he said to Job, "Where were you?" Job didn't know the answer. He wasn't conscious of the fact that he had an existence prior to his physical incarnation, any more than you or I are conscious. So if we go back to the beginning and say that God created everything out of himself, let's put it this way, that at the beginning there was just pure, undivided, undifferentiated, undemarcated, boundless spirit, and it was unconscious. It is difficult to conceive this, but nevertheless we must try to. There was just pure mind, energy, wisdom, intelligence, spirit, whatever words you care to describe. There was just God, nothing on the outside. God was the totality of himself. And there was no distinction within God, just pure, undifferentiated spirit. But God began to densify off part of himself to bring into existence the physical universe. So the physical universe is created out of the Spirit of God, but that part of the Spirit of God is stepped down in its vibration, so to speak, to become physical. Are you with me so far? So that at the beginning, God, there was nothing on the outside of God, so God, in a sense, was totally unconscious. After all, supposing you existed in empty space with not so much as a star in the sky, and you could not taste or see or feel or hear or smell, supposing you were cut off.
What brought God consciousness?
Sorry?
What brought him consciousness?
What brought God consciousness? Incarnation. The whole point of incarnation was that God should become conscious of himself. So we have a picture of God condensing himself into his physical universe so that every cell of creation ultimately has to become conscious of who and what it is. And what we're speaking of this evening and discussing together is our gradually becoming conscious of who and what we are, where we come from, and where we're going to. Well, what we're talking about is consciousness, and I suggested to you that the purpose of life was that we might realize God, or realize the consciousness of our divine spiritual origin, and then we see that our the real purpose of our existence is to return whence we came, but in the full and perfect consciousness of who and what we are. So everything has come out of God, whether we're talking about human beings or stars, suns and planets, whether we're talking about the animals in the jungle or the grass under your feet. Everything is conscious to some degree. Everything, as it comes into physical manifestation, enters upon the journey into consciousness. Now, I don't know whether any of you are gardeners or whether you have plants or grow plants, but many of you will probably know that if you talk to your plants, kindly that is, your plants will respond. It is generally recognised today that there is a certain consciousness in plants which enables them to respond to loving thoughts. The fact of the matter is that there is nothing in the universe which does not have a degree of consciousness. Now let me make four statements here. God sleeps in the mineral. When we think of the mineral world, the rocks and the ores, God sleeps in the mineral. He dreams in the plant, he stirs in the animal, and he awakes in man. Can you follow what we're saying in that? That there's a very, very low degree of consciousness in the mineral world, a slightly higher degree of consciousness in plants, a higher degree of consciousness still in the animal world, and a higher form of consciousness still in man. Man begins to wake up, and then he says, I am.
Man is part of the animal world, then.
Yes, part of the animal world, but he has advanced, or he has evolved. I'm not now speaking particularly about Darwinian evolution, or the Darwinian concept of evolution, but I'm talking about spiritual evolution now. Man has evolved spiritually beyond the animals to this extent that he now has a consciousness of himself. Not a self-consciousness. If you looked at the way animals behave, I think you would have to say that they behave out of an inbred instinct. Man has the capacity to think about himself and to think about his actions.
So does a dog? Yeah.
But does the dog have the ability to say, I am?
It might
Not
do
in
it.
our language.
Not in our language. Not in our language. Not in our language.
The dog knows when it's going on.
I thought somebody would come up with that about the dog knowing that it's done wrong. Yes, that's perfect. That's perfectly true. But let's just think about this question of consciousness for a moment, because what we're suggesting is that the whole of the universe has got to come alive to the consciousness of who and what it is. So man, in his evolutions, had to become conscious of himself. There was a time, millions of years ago, and you were around then, that your consciousness was like the consciousness of the animals today. And the animals today had a consciousness then which was like the consciousness of plants today. And the plants then had a consciousness which was like the minerals of today. Do you see what I'm saying? That consciousness evolves, that it expands, until in man we're able to think about ourselves, to take stock of our environment. We're able to aspire spiritually and to discern a spiritual meaning and dimension to our lives. So that whether you are a Christian or whatever spiritual path that you're on, the goal is to return to God in full consciousness of who and what you are, so that ultimately the whole universe is raised up to the perfect consciousness of God. It started from being God, totally unconscious. God began to densify part of himself off into his physical creation, and now that physical creation, through interaction with every other part of that physical creation, becomes conscious, and in development of that consciousness, it becomes conscious of every other part of the universe. So this is where the moral and spiritual aspect of life comes in. Because if you come to the realization, I have come from God, that doesn't make you feel big-headed or conceited, because there's nothing that has not come from God. But it changes your relationship to other people. Because then you have to say, well, so has my friend come from God, so have my parents come from God, so have the people that I don't get on with, so have they come from God, so have animals come from God, so have plants. So your whole way of looking at life then becomes changed, because you see that God is in everything, because everything has come from God. And so your life is changed, and you become a reverent person. You develop what I call the life of reverence and awe. You are filled with a sense of wonder and love at the fact that everything and all around you has come from God, and it's on its way back to God. So the purpose of life then is to come into this consciousness. And what happens when we die? Our physical bodies disintegrate, and we return into the spiritual planes. But then what do you think our responsibility is? What do you think we are faced with, let's put it that way, after we have died? Do we just go straight to heaven and enjoy the bliss of being reunited with God? Have you any thoughts about this?
The responsibility is now that we try our best to do what's right, and then when our physical bodies have disintegrated, then comes the time where do we go to heaven or do we go to hell?
Yes. Now we're coming now to talk about heaven and hell. So we're talking about consciousness in the life beyond. Now, what determines your consciousness after death, would you say? Really, we've just had the answer. But what is it that determines the quality of life after death, or your consciousness of life after death? Any answers?
No, I was going to ask something else.
Sorry?
I was going to ask something else.
Oh, you're going to ask something else. Well, let's just have an answer to this question. What is it that determines where you will go?
What you've been doing during your lifetime.
Exactly, what you have been doing in this life. How you have lived this life.
How do you know that? I don't get it. If you're God, you are part of everything comes from God. Yeah? So you are God. You're part of God. Yeah? So why go somewhere when you are God?
Well, the question is, do you? It's one thing to say that you come from God, but do you behave as though you came from God? That's the question.
We are God. We obviously behave like that. There must be evil spirits that try and mix in with the goodness and moral.
Well, what you're talking about, what you're suggesting, is that there are forces of evil which we have to overcome, that we might develop qualities of character, strength of character, what you understand by heaven and hell. What we're really talking about are planes of consciousness, and heaven, by definition, is the enjoyment of God, the being reunited with God. Hell, if you like, is the separation from the source. It's the separation from God. It's the pain of separation from your source. Now, what determines your experience of bliss or torment, for want of better terms, is how you have lived this life. Is it not? Because if you have lived this life in the consciousness that everything around you is part of the God from whom you came, then you will have consciously tried to live your life, to use a word which is bandied around so much and so little understood. You will have tried to live a life of love. And therefore, after death, each of us comes face to face with, it's like a video playback. We come face to face with everything that we have ever thought or said or done. We come face to face with the fact of our failures and our weaknesses, our sins, would be theological now, and the fact that other people have suffered because of the wrong that we have done. It's at this point that each of us then, because we are part of everything else and everything else is part of us, the offence which we have given to any other part of God's creation, we then experience within ourselves, because we are that other person or that other part of creation against which we sin. Do you follow that? Jesus said, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God, from whom you came, with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and your neighbour as yourself." Because your neighbour is yourself. You are your neighbour and your neighbour is you. Because you come from the same source. Therefore, after death, you are then confronted with all the good and all the evil that you have done, and inasmuch as you have harmed any part of God's creation, you have harmed yourself, and you feel within yourself the pain which you have inflicted on that creation. And that has to be worked out. So that after death there is a time of, I was going to say probation, a time, the Catholic Church calls it purgatory. It's a time of cleansing. It's a time of coming face to face with ourselves and realizing where we have failed and making a determination that in future we will be loving and ultimately entering again into the bliss of God. Now, the young man over there wants to ask a question.
What do you think about the near-death experiences? People who said that they...
Well, I deliberately haven't spoken about those this evening, because I guess if you haven't had a talk on that, sooner or later somebody will come along and give you a talk on that. The near-death experiences, which are being much investigated by certain people within medical science today, are the same as have always been described. They are perfectly valid. There's no reason whatsoever to disprove them. And indeed we can learn a great deal from them. They teach us many things, but at least they teach us, if we weren't convinced of this already, that there is a consciousness that exists outside of the body. I mean, part of the near-death experience is the fact of floating out of the body and looking down upon it and still feeling entire within oneself, even though one's carcass is on the operating table or underneath the wheels of a car. So it's a good question, that, and it's really part of what we're thinking about this evening. But certainly do read up everything that you can about near-death experiences. Yes.
You said that when you went to hell, you were separated from your source, which is God. You went through the sorrow of that.
Yeah.
If you don't believe in God anyway, you can't be separated from God if you don't believe in God. You're separated anyway.
Well, the thing is, when I speak about hell or the pains of hell, if you want to describe it in that way, you can never escape from yourself. That's the point. Sooner or later, we must face up to the fact of our responsibilities in life. Our responsibility is not just to enjoy ourselves and get as much out of life as possible, but our responsibilities to other people, our responsibilities to the entire human race, if you like, our responsibility to the environment. There's a lot more thinking along these lines today.
Yeah, but some people are perfectly good, it's just they don't believe in God. So what happens to them? Do they go to hell just because they don't believe in God, even though they might live a perfectly good life?
Ultimately, I might get shot down by some theologians or Christians here. Ultimately, it's not a question of one's mental belief or giving assent to the existence of God. Somebody may say, I believe in God. That is, giving mental assent to the existence of a super being whom we call God. the person who does not believe in God is in effect saying that they don't believe in themselves, because they are denying the source of their existence. We have to face this fact if we're thinking people, well, where do we come from? We could not just have suddenly begun to exist, any more than the universe can suddenly just have begun to exist without a cause.
That one little mental fault isn't going to finish up in hell, is it?
No, that's...
They can't believe it consciously, they may still, as you say, be good in every way, and therefore have a high quality of life and love, so when they die, they're not in purgatory.
That's right. You see, there is a form of, I think, extreme evangelicalism today, which demands that you get saved, that you believe on Jesus, that you repent of your sins, and the moment you believe on Jesus, you're saved, and that's all that's required, according to that particular line of thinking. If we think more along the lines which we've been discussing together this evening, you will see that idea leaves very much to be desired. Yes? Do I believe in reincarnation? Well, let me ask you the question. If there never was a time when you did not exist, and then will never come a time when you will cease to be, and you're only living for 70 or perhaps 100 years on this earth, where have you been for the past few million years, and where will you be in the next few million years?
Why can't we remember where peace?
Sorry?
Why can't we remember where peace?
Well, let's just come back to this. A belief in reincarnation is the corollary of everything that we have said this evening. Of course, the ego, that consciousness, comes from spirit down into matter, returns to spirit, comes back to matter, and continues to gain in experience, continues to expand its consciousness, continues to realize its responsibilities and to live responsibly and lovingly with regard to the rest of creation, until ultimately there is nothing that separates it from everything else. It enters into the consciousness of every other cell of God's creation. Put it another way, it's like if you're walking across the lawns here at Claysmore, you enter into the consciousness of every blade of grass as it is crushed beneath your feet. See, a lot of people think, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to see ghosts or apparitions or to have mystical experiences? Very wonderful indeed. But if you want to have experience of the delights of the spiritual world, you must also be prepared to experience the bad aspects of the spiritual world. It's all consciousness. That's what we're talking about. So, yes, I do believe in reincarnation, even if I didn't find it in the Bible, which I do. And even if I didn't find it in the Church Fathers, which I do, I would have to believe it because I know within my own being, within my own self, that there never was a time when I did not exist, and there will never come a time when I will cease to be. It is this knowledge that actually begins to quicken one's consciousness into the awareness of previous lives, and future lives to come, of course. I would know about it intuitively. If you understand the word intuitively, I would know it within myself. In fact, I always have known it within myself, long before I became a really committed Christian in the way that I think of myself today. Yes, I've always known that. The interesting thing is, you see, that somewhere within us is the consciousness of the past. Any of you who have studied the subject of hypnotic regression will know that it is possible for... I don't advocate this. I'm not suggesting you do it, and I'm not suggesting that you take for gospel everything that comes to light in these sessions. But you will know of the fact that it is possible to go to a session with a hypnotist in which he will regress you. He will take you back in time, not just to when you were 18 months old, but he can take you back to the time when you were in your mother's womb. I've got an interesting tape recording of various people speaking about this on the radio, extracts from tapes which were made by a hypnotherapist of people who were regressed to the time when they were in the womb. But they've also been regressed to the point that people have remembered, or have purported to remember, because we cannot prove it, except in a very few cases, they have purported to remember lives going back perhaps a century or two, and sometimes 1,000 or 2,000 years or so. The fact is that you do know. And one of the subject came up of near-death experiences. The fact is that part of the near-death experience is that suddenly you see your whole life pass before you, as it were, in a moment of time. So, whatever you have thought, said, done in this life is contained somewhere. It's locked up within your consciousness, and under the right circumstances, and certainly after death, that consciousness will be quickened to us, and we shall see again all of the life that we have lived, and we shall see the mistakes that we have made, and see how we have failed, and we shall actually experience within ourselves the joy that we have created for others, and also the pain which we have unwittingly inflicted on others. So life, death, beyond. There never was a time when you did not exist. There will never come a time when you will cease to be. And your purpose in life is to realize God, to realize your source, to enter into living, conscious communion with Him whom we call God, whom we find in manifestation in this great world around us. Somebody will say, I don't know whether there's a God or not. That's not the most important thing. The most important thing is to recognize our oneness with all creation and to extend to creation that love and reverence and awe and respect and carefulness that we would wish others to extend to us. And I think we'd better leave it at that point.